everyone, and welcome to the Azure DevFest. For those of you that have not been in a previous session, this instance of the DevFest was focused on how to leverage Azure in order to build and secure critical infrastructure services. And as such, we conducted a number of sessions in the past. They were mainly focused on security. So we had started analyzing and understanding on how Azure can help you implement basically the Cybersecurity Code of Practice 2.0, which was recently released by the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. And then we moved on to understand more in depth how to put a strategy and basically a number of layers of protections around the solutions that you deploy on Azure. So we explore the defense in depth, the ID approach. We spoke about how to take a modern approach to security by leveraging SecOps and also security as a code as part of the DevOps CI/CD pipelines. Lastly, in the last session, we spoke about scaling and how you can actually scale your cloud native solutions depending on what are your performance needs, controlling costs at the same time. And all of these past sessions available on demand to you in case you want to replay or to attend them if you didn't register for them. Later on, after our today's sessions, I will share what is the link to access the recordings. And as the last session is today's the last session of the DevFest, we will be talking about optimizing cross-tenancy solutions, which basically we will elaborate on a set of approaches and best practices on how you can enable P2B scenarios of collaboration across environments that are deployed across multiple tenants. And so what are the complexities related to cross-tenant environment and integration on Azure? We will explain how to design solution and implement best practices to go around that. And this is a common scenario, especially when you may end up having different tenants to represent and isolate different organizations and different business units within a parent organization. And so it's a very interesting scenario. Let's maybe now move on quick to the next slide before I elaborate further and introduce you to the speakers and talk a little bit about the housekeeping rules. The previous slides. Thank you, Akash. So the session again is going to be recorded. It will be available on demand later on to you. You should see a Q&A panel, and you can use this panel to submit questions during the sessions. We will answer as much as possible those questions in the Q&A panel in itself. But then at the end, we will also reserve a 10-minute slot to go through your Q&A and questions and answers, and so we can engage in a more interactive discussions, especially for the complex questions that we may not be able to address in the panel itself. You may watch the event and participate to the Q&A, but please do not share your audio or video. Now, let me introduce you to the speaker that today will talk about how to optimize cross-tenancy solution. Akash, here with us from the Customer Success Unit of Microsoft Singapore, is a cloud solution architect based out of Singapore. He has done a lot of work in this region, and he has gone through a mature, extensive experience on architecture and in a multi-cloud type of environment and integration. And also he has worked with digital natives, including some of the biggest unicorns here in Southeast Asia. The second speaker of today is Charles. Charles is a solution architect specializing on data and AI on Azure. He's also based out of Singapore, and he brings a lot of experience around big data and analytics space. So as today we go through the cross-tenant environments, we will have, of course, infrastructural components we will deep dive into, as well as data type of components that also need to be taken into account and integrated. Hence, Akash and Charles will cover the different aspects. And in the chat, helping us to answer the questions that you have, we have Dave. who also is based in Singapore, with a solution architect with a lot of background and experience around data and AI. He has worked extensively across Singapore, including working with government agencies, pharmaceutical and manufacturing firms. And I'm Andrea. We are all part of the same team here, Customer Success in Singapore, and I am your host and moderator for today's session. So without further ado, let me pass the mic to Akash to introduce us to the topic.
Okay, thank you, Andrea, for introduction. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, which part of the world you are joining. I'll quickly take you through the agenda and a little bit of expectations. As mentioned by Andrea, this is a slightly unique topic because cross-tenancy has a unique requirement, and a lot of in a recent case past, there's a lot of use cases has emerged, and we'll take you through that. So this is not a kind of a training or a workshop. We are just sharing our experiences and learning in the field. So, and views can be opinionated because architecture changes from customer to customer, requirement to requirement. So you can definitely fine tune. But yes, this is an experience in a real time while working with the customers. Now, agenda is that we are going to start with a use case discussion, as in why do we need cross-tenant solution? We are going to briefly talk about control plane, data plane part. What is this about? How do we control those access? How does cross-tenant work actually in the real life world of the world, right? Because there are a lot of IDs comes into the picture, app ID, enterprise ID, and a login method, cross-tenant enterprise architecture. We will be also walking you through with the private connectivity. There is also a unique use case of a cross-tenant with ISV, where if in case you are an ISV organization and want to provide an application to your customer in their tenant, how do you access that so that you can service them, and how does customer operate? Quickly, we will be talking about that. There is a case discussion we will be doing with you, wherein as a specific use case, how do we tackle it in a different ways? And if time permits, we'll have a quick demo. With that, I move to my next slide, use case for cross tenancies. So in a nutshell, I'm seeing it's kind of emerging. So if you see these blue dots are tenant, and when we say tenant, we are calling about Azure Active Directory tenant. As I expect that you must be working with Azure already, and Azure, every organization Azure has an Azure Active Directory. We call it a tenant, and tenant is a kind of a hard isolation, like it's like a boundary which defines an environment from an IAM and access control point of view. So the first scenario is like that. Let's take an example, a merger scenario. If a company has been acquired or consolidation happen, and these different companies have different Azure Active Directory tenant. Now going forward, since they are merging or consolidation, they are becoming one tenant. So in that case, this merger doesn't happen over the night. It is a transition it's a long-term activity, and wherein you need to do a migration transition. So point is like, how do you doing that migration and transition? How do you provide that control access for these B and C tenant while they are moving to the A? So that is one. The same goes if you're splitting the organization, demerger happening, wherein A was a tenant and now it's becoming a two-tenant organization. So in that case, during the transition, how are we going to provide access control to the different organizations? So that's another way, a scenario wherein it comes handy, cross-tenancy. Another scenario is multi-tenant setup. Most of the organizations, I've seen some organizations which they have different tenant for different countries, and each country uses their own tenant for authentication, authorization, and accessing those workload. So which is fair, which is fine. So in that case, if B needs to access A, how do you access? How do you? Same goes for the B. A needs to access C. How do you do that? There are concepts like B2B guest accounts. There are concepts you can do those, but how do we do it from an application point of view, from a workload access point of view? So that is another use case wherein it becomes handy for such kind of a solution, wherein cross-tenancy comes into the picture. And the below one, central expertise. This is quite unique, and I've seen it. This is very important, kind of becoming common. As you know, like the talent, it's all about resource, skill, and talent, right? Let's take an example. One of the organization has a skill or expertise running in their tenant, but they have few more organizations who needs to be served by these people operating under one tenant. So in that case, how this person can seamlessly access those tenants and operate it and perform the job. So what is going to be authentication? What's going to be authorization process? That is another way. And similarly, this is from a human-centric point of view. The same concept goes from an application point of view, wherein now you're not accessing a tenant, but the application running here is basically doing an operation in a central location. So which basically means, let's take an example, an application is running itself in a tenant A, but needs to access some data from app tenant B, needs to access data from tenant C, but the application will run here, the data will still reside here. In that case, how do you address those? So that's where again cross-tenant, multi-tenant application kind of things comes into the picture. And the last point is ISV scenario. ISV scenario is ISV, independent software vendor. They have built an application. They publish this application on Azure in their tenant, but they want to publish this application in a customer tenant. So, but they will serve it from their own tenant. So how do you do that? So in that case, something like ISV Lighthouse Solutions comes into the picture, wherein you can publish as a managed app, and we'll quickly talk about it as in what is the way you do that. So these are the various scenarios we have come across in the field, wherein cross-tenancy comes into the picture, where people needs to access different tenant from other tenant on an application on access point of view. So next slide, Charles.
Thank you, Akash. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so zooming in, how does that look like from an architecture point of view? So on Azure, all operation can be divided into two categories, control plane and data plane. You will use the control plane to manage all the resources, within your subscription or tenant, and you will use the data plane to use the capabilities exposed by these resources. So for example, you will create a storage account through the control plane, and you will read write and read from the storage account from your data plane. So as you can see on the right side, you have this REST API example. All requests, for the control plane operation are set to one URL. Actually, we have four. The Azure Resource Manager URL. This is for Azure Global. You have different one for Germany, government, and China, but this is how you will deploy and manage the resources. Now, when it comes to the data plane, all the requests for data plane operation are set to an endpoint that is specific to your resources. For example, in that example right here, to detect the language operation, you will use your cognitive service within your tenant. So you might be familiar with this design pattern. It's a common, decoupled architecture, especially when it comes to PaaS and SaaS offering. For example, Databricks or Synapse, where all the resources will be managed on your behalf through a different tenant control plane, and then you will use as an end user this service within your tenant, and that's the data plane. Back to you, Akash.
So in the next few slides, we'll be now going a little bit in a hands-on sort of scenario, like what does it work? So how does cross-tenant operation works eventually? Because what does it require to perform cross-tenant operation from a data operation? Like as I told you, central operation was a use case wherein data operation is happening on one tenant, but data is sitting in another tenant. We don't want to take it out, right? So you are doing CRUD operation, but the data still read, right, and sitting in the other tenant while the data applications running here, right? There are considerations comes when you do those cross-tenant application from a central side is reconnection reset, because the concept of a tenant ID comes into the picture. Every connection needs to be passed explicitly tenant ID, while my application, and why do you need various IDs? So we will give you quick glance. What is tenant ID? What's application ID? What is object ID? And what is service principal? And how do we use those in the context of a cross-tenant or a multi-tenant application in a organization point of view? So kind of a glimpse design wherein we are showing you there is a one tenant and there is tenant A and tenant B. Right. So what I'm doing it, my users here, like I am accessing this application from either of the tenant. I can access either tenant. Having said that, I have a necessary access control. And first and foremost, I have an application registered in both tenant. So first and foremost, so how does it work? So what is important is there are two things comes into the picture. You will hear in Azure Active Directory, you will go and see app registration, you will see enterprise application. So there is a confusion. What is this about? Why don't we see all the applications enterprise application in application registration, while we can see it on the side. So you need to look into this point of view. So application registration is basically an application object. This is an application object really where you configure application settings. And when you configure this in a one tenant, you get in return two things: application ID, object ID. This is associated to your tenant, right? Let's assume I'm going to use multi-tenant app, right? A single tenant or multi-tenant, but I'm going to use this in case multi-tenant app. And when you register an application object registration, which is application object, it also do a registration of an application in enterprise application. So enterprise application is basically a service principal object. So we can call it as a service principal, but this will acquire settings from application object. This is important part, because when you are going to access this application in either of the tenant, you are going to use application ID, which you're getting it, but application ID will get a representation with the object ID, which is like associated to the directory. So why this is coming into the picture, and this is becoming a little bit conflict, because enterprise application, we will also have other side of applications like Snowflake, Salesforce, AWS. So these all can also be provided by us under enterprise application. While you can publish your own application as application registration, we get a globally unique application ID. If you see, that's why I put it a green color. So this will be still same, application ID here is still same. And when you create another service principal in the other tenant, you can still use the same application ID and create it. So what will happen here in this tenant, you will have another object ID, but this is mapped to the application ID here. Similarly, the application ID here will create another object ID, but it is associated to this tenant. So when you do a access control, you will do the object ID association here, but both object ID are mapped to the same application ID, and it is acquiring the setting from here. So that's how it works. So in a nutshell, so enterprise application is service principal, but you will use application ID for authentication or authorization. And how does it look in a real world? If you see the second example in this slide, so we basically know like Azure AD SP create for our back is a kind of a simple command to create service principal. You get a service. When you run that command, you get three things: application ID, object ID, tenant ID, and the secret. So when you go to the other tenant, you basically run Azure AD SP create ID, and the ID you are using from the previous tenant where you created. So which is the application ID. And using that, you're creating the enterprise application service principal in your new tenant using the old service principal application ID, which was created in the other tenant. So that's what is important. So what it is going to happen in the next step. So when you have the same application registered in your tenant, also you will simply use login method like this: login service principal user application ID, right, from the enterprise application. Password same. So if you notice this part, user input and password will be same, even for tenant A and for tenant B. The only thing which is changing is tenant ID, because tenant IDs are different. So that's what is real. We call it like a cross-tenant or multi-tenant service principal, wherein your application ID same, your secret same, and you are across both tenant, and then you assign it. And if you want to flip flop from other tenant to one tenant to another tenant, what you need to just change is the tenant ID. And that's where we were saying, if you have a central application running, and if you want to switch from one tenant to another tenant, there is a tenant ID switch you need to make. And for that, there will be a connection agent. So that's where you need to design your application as in how does it handle it on the fly. Now, the important part is in an application scenario, like if let's take an example, you're coding your application and you want to access the other tenant. How do you get tenant ID? Let's say you don't know tenant ID, right? But you know the storage account, and you know, as a storage account, everything has a unique URL name. So what you can do, you can create a kind of a recursive or kind of a scroll method in your code wherein you can pass on get and header for this part, like the way I mentioned it. And if you put the URL of the storage account and the blob, it will return the tenant ID. So you can basically create a logic in your tenant, and basically using that logic, you can get the tenant ID of the destination storage account or a resource. And using that tenant ID, you can create a login method, because login method will also demand, and that will take in tenant ID, and then you can successfully perform your authentication authorization. So this is the things which you may not find it quite easily in the document because it's here and there. Like, so we have worked it, we have found the ways, we are sharing with you. The another important part is the SDKs. As you must have been, some of you may have already been using Azure Active Directory authentication library, but the important part is that we have moved away from this. So MSAL is a new method, and if you go to this GitHub, there are ample amount of samples available, whether it's a .NET application, Java or Go. Use those libraries, MSAL library, for doing a authentication authorization using Azure AD. So next slide. Now we talked about two tenant. We talked about how do we create it, how do we connect it, how does it look in a cross organization tenant kind of an enterprise architecture. And if I'm showing you here itself, the same thing which I described it in previous slides is that I have two tenant. This is one tenant, destination tenant. This is my source tenant, right? The requirement here is that the user here should be able to access these storage or an account or the resources privately, first and foremost. Secondly, I don't need to have a go to their tenant, and I don't need to have a separate account and separate credential. So I will use what I'm doing in the first step. I'm basically creating a multi-tenant application here in this tenant, which will create my app, give me application ID and secret. Using that, I'm having an enterprise application service principal. I use the same app ID, create an enterprise application here in the destination tenant. Now that tenant, which is Azure AD, now we're having an object. And using that object, I will grant the access here. So I will grant a permission, whether data plane permission or a control plane. So that will grant me access from here. The next is, it's optional but good to have. Even though like a backend, the access for data is like Azure resources always routed by Microsoft backbone, but you can further granularly block it using private endpoint, and the private endpoint doesn't need to sit here. Actually, in this storage account, I can have a cross-tenant private endpoint, so which basically means private endpoint will be here, but the interface is sitting here. So which basically means I will, once a user jump and go and access this storage account, first it will use the credential from here, which is the same app ID, same secret. The only thing is changing the tenant ID of this. Secondly, the accessing of this storage account is via private link, and the private link endpoint is sitting in his own tenant, in his own VNet, right? So considering he has approved. So that's how you should basically create a cross-tenant super secured or enterprise architecture when you want to deploy such solution. And we'll share the GitHub. I published this also. The next is we discuss about organization point of view. Now we are talking about ISV point of view. And let's take an example. You have a service provider. You're an application provider and you have a customer. So there is a provider tenant, there's a consumer tenant. So how do you do that? Because like apps can be available via marketplace and it's sold as a third party. How do you do that? And in that case, how do you provide access? So we have a concept called manage app in Azure, right? So you create a manage application in your publisher account. And when you basically create that app, you basically publish this in a customer tenant. You will basically, when you create a publish it, there will have a two resource group created. One is a resource group called manage resource group, and then there is a normal resource group, application resource group. So your consumer will basically have access to the application resource group, which will show you manage app. And in this, he will have full access. So he can do all things. But manage resource group, which is still sitting in customer environment, customer tenant, and customer subscription, the consumer will not have a full access. He will have a limited access. And the publisher, which is the ISV, will have a full access to perform current operation. So in that case, this publisher account will have a full access from his own tenant to the customer tenant only for this resource. And this happen on the fly, like when you create a managed application kind of stack on this definition point of view. And why do we have this operation? The reason is because this is where the ISV has published the resources and he doesn't want, and he's managing those. If there is a misconfiguration happen by mistake by customer, the application can have a trouble. So in that case, this is a unique way we created a mechanism wherein publisher create a package definition using managed application, published it in customer tenant, yet he will have a full access to the resource group which he's managing it, nothing else. And customers still have access and he can still take a logs for a monitoring mechanism point of view. And the application resource, he will have full control. So this is a ISV scenario. If in case some of you are ISVs dealing into like this situation, that's what you need to take it. If you want to publish an application, think about managed application, use it in Lighthouse tenant and do that operations. Now we have done discussions about various parameters. Now what we will start discussing about the use cases. So over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Akash. So this is a real world use case that Akash and myself had the opportunity to work on some time back. So we have this organization and they want to manage all the different compute layers in one tenant. So you can see that organization and multiple organizations, and due to some regulation, this other business unit, tenant 2, they have to manage their own data lake powered by ADLS Gen 2, but they don't manage the compute layer, right? The compute layer is managed by tenant 1, right? So now, thanks to multi-tenant service principle that Akash talked about earlier, we can implement this kind of architecture pattern. So in that example, you can see there is Kubernetes and there is a Spark cluster running on top of Kubernetes. Now, end users, data analysts, and data scientists, they want to access their own tenant data lake powered by their storage account, ADLS Gen 2. Now they can easily log in into this Spark cluster, or there is a UI, some kind of web UI, a notebook or a SQL client. And thanks to the service multi-tenant service principle, they can access their own data. And they don't need to manage their own compute layer, because it will benefit the cost, obviously. The tenant 1 can charge back to tenant 2, and they can only focus on what they need, to make their business more efficient. So now some things to keep in mind when you use this cross-tenant or multi-tenant service principle. You still need to manage a secret. Secret is a password, so it is something that you need to be taking care of and be, it's very sensitive information. So good practice is obviously to rotate this secret, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, depending on the policy. I think the shorter the better. And you want to do that using some also built-in services in Azure. Key Vault can help you doing that. You have automated secret rotation, you have versioning. So when you get, when you use the secret to get the token, from the Spark cluster to actually access your own storage account, you can do that in a more efficient way. Obviously, you want to automate this when you rotate all these secrets. You don't want to do it manually. So it's better to implement a CI/CD pipeline that you can do with DevOps or GitHub on Azure, and having some approval process, in between, right? Akash, can you please go to the next slide? Zooming in again a little bit more. So for this specific use case, so it was a Spark cluster using Hadoop ABFS. That's how it works with Spark, but not only with Spark. You will have the same mechanism with Apache Hive, Hadoop Hive, or Presto, any open source MPP compute engine that you want to manage yourself on Kubernetes. If you want to access the underneath storage layer, ADLS Gen 2 above storage, you probably need to go through this Azure Blob file system driver, right? So don't reinvent the wheel, right? Try to look into the project, go to Git, look at the source code, and this is what we found with Akash actually for this specific scenario, that there is actually a class that's provided by the community, Hadoop developer, to extend the way that you will get a token, to make it more flexible, right? You have different ways, so it will use the OAuth 2, obviously, API protocol to get the token, but you have different way to get that. If you want to be more flexible and in a multi-tenant environment, which is not as easy as in one tenant, probably want to implement your own logic. So in Hadoop, you have this class that you can extend, and using the get access token, you can implement this logic, and that will retrieve all the secret ID, map the storage account to a tenant ID. So using the service principal details, as Akash mentioned, you will be able to get the key, get a token, and access, even if the token rotates or the secret rotates, you can access your underneath tenant. Back to you, Akash.
Yeah, so like Charles mentioned, important part, there are ways you can access multi-tenant, which we have shared, multi-tenant app and all. Don't try to reinvent the vehicle. Like most of the times there are application samples available already given by the same the whichever application. So look into that. Do you have any extension token? Because as I mentioned, important part is tenant ID still needs to be fed in for every storage account. Even the storage account is unique, but to access a storage account, the injection of tenant ID is must. And in that case, as I mentioned in the previous few slides back, how do you retrieve tenant ID from a storage account? There is a way which you can do, which you can embed in your code and crawl out like tenant ID and then inject it into your access process. So these are all things you need to keep in mind. So next use case, the same use case, we discussed about service principal. We also heard Charles talking about secret. There are ways of handling secret, like you can have a rotation of secret, automated rotation. There are samples available even for that. You can keep secrets in your key vault, which is fair, but even to automatically rotate secret, there are samples available which can use Azure function. Somewhere we can use other triggers. Now, how do we go away from secrets even? So in this scenario, so there are like you heard manage identity, but manage identity is only mapped to the single tenant, right? It's not multi-tenant, right? So how do we, can we have something like a manage identity? So we are coming up something like we have recently announced something called workload identity federated identity credentials. So which basically means you can create a multi-tenant service principal, but this service principal will not have a secret or certificate. You can basically map that service principal to the Kubernetes cluster. In this case, I'm taking a sample. It is also available for GitHub and other few more things. For a Kubernetes cluster service account mapping to a particular namespace. So in that case, what happened when you create a cluster using that workload identity, and workload identity, we have also launched the manage add-on for that, which is in preview in Ignite. So two things, workload identity, federated identity credentials is GA. Manage add-on for AKS is in preview, already announced, up and running. So using those two combination, when you create a cluster and you use that credential in the process, what it will do, basically, it will directly inject the service account mapping to the AAD client ID and tenant ID in the pod as an environment variable. So you can see here that even the pod has a Azure ID, client ID already given to that, the tenant ID is already given to that, and the secret associated to that. So there is no secret actually because it's a secret list, but we have created a mapping in a service principal. The service principal will trust that, hey, the request coming from this cluster, from this namespace is genuine. You can grant an access to whichever tenant or the resource you want to access from this cluster. And in that case, you can do the same operation secretless across the tenant without any ease. So this is the way forward for Kubernetes. So we have federated identity credential available for GitHub. There are one more scenario we are available. It's an area which we are looking toward in terms of a future to make it much more advanced. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Akash. So now a more GUI approach in a different design pattern, architecture pattern. So Microsoft Purview, if you don't know, it's our one-stop, governance SaaS tool. So it's not only governance, but it's data cataloging, lineage, end-to-end, and now in preview, in place data sharing. So different approach, and you have different scenario again, when it comes to multi-tenant, and you have to share data with different business units or organizations. So first scenario, for example, you need to collaborate with external partners and you need to share some financial data, scientist data, any data. You can do that in a very easy way and near real time without data duplication. And that's very important because you can scale very well. So at scale, you will be able to, it's like a Symlink. You will share, we will have a demo, hopefully we'll have enough time to go through the demo. That will be my demo, I will show that. That in a few clicks and manage from one dashboard through Purview, you can share data with anyone in a very controlled way. So you can share data with your partners and they can benefit, or you have this relationship with your partner where they are going to help you in some business and the other way around. Now the second one, this scenario where you have this central data lake, so it's a bit quite opposed to what we shared earlier, where you have different multiple data lakes and one central compute layer. This is more a data mesh approach, right? So more and more organizations, they want to be, to make use of the data, share data with different business units. So it's to make decisions, in a more data-driven way and use their own tool. So with that feature, in-place data sharing, you can share any data from, a central data lake that is managed by one team where you have, it's a single source of truth. You have all the organization data set, but you want to share some data, specific data set in a controlled way with different business units. You can do that now, and they can, use their own tool, dashboard, Synapse, Databricks, Power BI to access this data set in place. Okay, another scenario, ISV. So some organization, they will leverage some, niche boutique organization, startup that they are very good in at what they are doing. For example, an organization, they have a huge amount of data, but they don't have any data scientists, and they want to rely, especially in fintech, for example, a bank, they want to get a fintech to implement a scoring model for them, right? So they will share again in a controlled way at scale, because it's not data duplication, it's kind of a symbolic link, as I said, with a fintech. And the fintech will be able to read, it's a read only, okay, read the data, train a model, test a model, and do some scoring, credit scores, and give the result back, same way back to the bank, or just deploy, implement that model and give that model back to this organization, the data producer. And okay, for the last scenario, so as the volume of data grows year over year, some organization, they want to monetize that, right? Because it can be another stream of revenue, right? So in a very automated way, they can sell some data to data consumers, other organization in obviously different tenants, and they can automate this through SDK and API, thanks to Microsoft Purview in-place data sharing. Thanks, Akash.
Sure, thank you, Charles. And with that, we will now start a quick demo. So we have two demos. So first demo, I'll show you what I talk about it, cross-tenant application, how do I access different storage account, authenticate, operate, and then see the data. So I'll reshare my screen, the one which I have demo. So I want to show you first, this is what I'm trying to do. So this is one of my tenant. If you notice, this is a tenant called akashoutlook.com. There is another tenant I have, which is different, akash@cloudgan.biz. What I'm trying to do here, this is a jump host running in this tenant, and it has a VNet. From this jump box running in this tenant, from here, I'm going to access that storage account here and perform a CRUD operation, which is sitting in a different tenant, right? I can do it in a Cloud Shell. I can do it in a jump box. I will show you first. So first and foremost, what I'll try to do, I'll show you, do I have any access as of now? So let me see, clear it. Azure AD account, I don't have access. Right, so because I'm not logged in, what I'm going to do, I'm just gonna copy paste my command, and obviously you can see my secret, but obviously I'm going to delete this secret after this, so no need to that. So this is what I'm going to do. Is it AZ login, service principal, user account, which is my app ID, and this app ID should exist in both. So let me show you if that exists in both. So what you can do, as I showed you last time, this is an enterprise application where all service principal sits. And let me go to application called Cross-Tenant. You can see EB and ending with Z99. So that's the one which I'm using it, EB ending with B99. If I go to the other tenant, it should also be residing there. So if I go inside this application, enterprise application, I should also see same application ID, but different object ID, as I mentioned, because object IDs are mapped. It's an instantiation of your application. So you can see EB ending with B99. So if I little bit expand B99, but object ID is different, hit1B, and in that case, 31DC. So two different object ID, which is a representation in the respective Azure AD, but the application is one. So I'll log in my jump box. You can see I'm using the first tenant ID, which is this is the tenant ID, which is the tenant ID ending with 5FC. So let me change it actually. Okay, I'm going to use it for other tenant. So which is the tenant. If I go here, this is the one 4C8. So 4C8. and I will copy that tenant ID. Just a minute. All right. This and that. So at this point of time, you can see because this why it is throwing error. The reason is because I have not granted this object any permission. So if I let me show you one thing. If I use this variable and run the same command now, it will do a login. But if I do now storage account list, you will not see anything. And the reason is because it doesn't have access to anything in this tenant. What I'll do now, I will basically grant an access. So if I go inside my destination tenant, access control, let me go to particular storage account. This is a tenant ID, tenant, the storage account. I'll go to role assignment. And what I'll do a data plane access. So let's say blob contributor. It's a data plane permission. I'll choose the cross tenant. You can see, and if I choose that, it's coming up with the object ID. It's not an application ID because as I mentioned, this is a representation in the Azure AD of this tenant, but it will take the settings from the application ID. So I'll do that. Next, review assign, permission done. Even now, if I do the same, let's get it rolled. So it's getting done. Even if I now do that, I still not have any access. The reason is because it's not a data control plane access. So what I'll do, I'll create a sample doc. So let's say touch sample.txt. So ls, I have that some sample files and I'll do a blob upload operation now. So I'll do a name called say DevFest and the file is, and I'll tell you what I'm trying to do in this case, sample_doc. Yep. So what I'm doing is I'm simply doing a data plane operation, storage blob upload, the storage account of my destination storage account name, auth mode. I'm already using a login method because I'm already logged in. Container name, source container and file doc. So let's do that. So if I do, done. Even though I don't have access to the storage account from a control plane, but I have access to the data plane. So that's how it works. So if I show inside my source container, the container name was source container. So if I go inside, the name of the file was blob was DevFest, which was uploaded, and there you go. So this is how it's quickly I can use it. Now, if I need to do the, what I can show you one more thing is if I show you the storage account URL, let me take out that storage account name. This is the storage account. And if I go and do a NS lookup, this is another thing. This storage account is not only I'm accessing from across the tenant, but this is going through private link, private endpoint, and the private endpoint is sitting in a source tenant, which is here. So if I go inside my storage source tenant, this is my source tenant. If you notice here, let me group it by types. There are two private endpoints, source tenant, destination tenant. But let me show you one thing. If I show you there in this storage account, go to the networking. The networking is blocked, but only enabled for private endpoint. And this is the private endpoint which I have enabled. So you have a mechanism of creating a private endpoint. If I click on this, it will throw an error. The reason is this private endpoint is not sitting in this tenant, it's sitting in a different tenant. But we have created a cross-tenant private endpoint. Therefore, it is allowed, but now you cannot access that resource. So you are given it at a resource level. So that and the private endpoint is here. So if you go to the DNS configuration inside this private endpoint, you would see this is the storage FQDN. We have mapped it, and that's how we are accessing it. So this was a quick demo which I want to show you. How do we quickly do that? Access it. If I need to change this, let me show you. Try to do one more. Or if I need to just change it to other tenant, what I need to just change it is basically this. Changing to the tenant ID, I can simply switch over from one tenant to another tenant without making any changes. So let me show you if I put it this at this point of time because I have to log out. So that's why it's basically showing that way. Oops. and there is a issue, but this goes perfectly fine in that way, right? You can switch over from one tenant to another tenant without any problem. To you, Charles.
Okay, let me share my screen. Thank you, Akash. Are you sure you want to share? Yes. And that will be this one. Okay, so Purview, as I said, and I forgot to say that Purview is a PaaS running on Azure. It can access all your assets, not only in Azure, but on-prem and outside of Azure in different cloud as well, right? So let's say I'm Jen, I'm logged as Jen. You can see I'm trying to zoom in so it's big enough, and I'm a fintech. I have this customer data set, and I'm actually outsourcing the model for credit scoring, right? And I'm going to share this asset. So you can see that's a quick view of Purview. I've got all my collection, different assets, and I've got, I can search customer data, CSV that I need to share with different, the schema, name, bank, and so on, right? Some sensitive information. And I want to share that with, I'm outsourcing actually this model that my customer doesn't know, but I want to share that with the best data scientist I know, myself from Microsoft. Jen is from a different organization, Contoso. I'm not a data scientist, by the way. And I'm going to do that. So I'm going to go to data sharing. I'm going to, it's already shared, right? But quickly, creating a new share is super easy. It should be there. So I'm going to give it a name, in-place sharing, description. This is the data set you need, right? And select the collection, right? So it's under customer. Okay, so I'm going to do that, continue, right? Add an asset. So it's on ADLS Gen 2. That's my storage. Okay, and you can see that I've got the CSV file that I want to share. It's on ADLS Gen 2, right? And then I'm going to send that to myself. And I can send an expiration date. So after some time, just the link can expire. So me, I will not have access anymore. Okay. So once you do that and click on OK, I'm just going to cancel that. I'm going to get an email that looks like that, right? So I've been invited to access some data from Contoso. I know it's from Jen. You have the name, you can put some description, and then I will click on that and I will log in into my Purview workspace, right? So I'm here, as you can see, it's me logging into my Purview, and I will have a pending that's already accepted. Now I'm going to accept that, and I'm going to map it, right? Okay, so I've got that. I know it's from Jen, and it's already mapped. So I'm going to map this shared asset to my storage account. Okay, that's done. So now if I actually look into my storage account, that's me. I could see assets. Sorry, where is this? Ship, close, assets. That's this asset, and you can see that it's mapped. This is my storage account. So now I've got a link, read access only to Jen's data, right? So now you can see if I log into my client to see my storage account containers, I will see that under shared Contoso customer data, this is a folder I created. I see the CSV file. Okay, now using any query engine or compute engine like Databricks, I can, obviously when you do a demo, you have to log out and log in again. Okay, it's coming, let me zoom in. So now, right, so using my credential in my storage account, I can read this CSV file, so using PySpark in that case, and I can read that file, log that into a data frame, and use that to train, test, and build a model, right? So in place, and anytime, Jen can change the data or just get access, so I don't have access anymore, right? That's it for my demo.
Okay, thank you. Let me share back my screen.
Yep, sharing. Yep.
So we are almost coming to the end of the session. So over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Akash and Charles. Thank you to the audience as well. There were a few questions that maybe we have a few minutes to answer them. Some of the questions were surfaced and we have answered into the chat, but there are some. Maybe let's start from the one that we were not able to answer in the chat. So there is a question which Akash was related to when you presented the view, the architectural, the logical view of the two different tenants accessing their own environments, and the question from the audience was, so what happened then if the two tenants have separate authentication mechanics, different modes, like for example, one is authenticated through SSO and the other tenant instead is using SAML. So in that way, how would authentication and authorization work?
Thank you, Andre, for the question. Yeah, definitely important consideration, these all things, because we were discussing about cross-tenant service principle, right? So cross-tenant service principle, if you are using, and if you have SSO kind of things or an MFA, you need the best practices to avoid those things, because it's not a user who is making a call, because user needs to be accessed. When you use a service principle, it is a trusted application object in your AD. So you need to free it up from MFA or other mechanism, so that, and that's how it basically works in a best practices way. Because otherwise, because it's a inhuman intervention, like it's an application making call, how it's going to handle that SSO, how it's going to handle MFA. So those things needs to be separated out.
Thanks, Akash. I think this clarifies the question. One more, maybe Charles, is this question was asked while you were presenting the various ways in which you could share data across different tenants, and this is related to purview and data share. The question is, when mapping a shared asset in purview, in place data sharing, where would the data be stored?
Thanks. Good question. So it's in place. So it's like a symbolic link. So the data would be still stored in the the producer, the data. So the one actually sharing the data. On the receiver, the consumer, you only store some metadata. So it stays in place. It doesn't go from one tenant to another. So you can share potentially petabytes, right? Because there is no data movement, only some metadata.
Thanks, Charles. I think then there were a few other questions, but I think we provided all the necessary details in the chat window. And maybe since we have 1 minute left, maybe Akash, if you can help me go to the next slide. Yes. So first of all, please leave your feedback here following this QR code. It's a simple form. It takes only a few seconds to fill it, but it gives us a great indicator on how we can further make these sessions better and more relevant to you, especially topics of your interest that we can touch upon in the next DevFest we organize. So this is the QR code. If there are additional questions or you want to know more about the topics we went through today and in the previous sessions, so feel free to reach out to us. So the speakers and then myself, we all had provided our LinkedIn details. Feel free to ping us. This was the last session for this DevFest. But if you follow this QR code, you can navigate back to all the recordings for this session and the previous ones. And maybe one more slide. And if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you can find even more content around Azure and all the various services that you can leverage to enable a number of scenarios, whether it is about securing your infrastructure, scaling it, implementing DevOps CI/CD pipelines, or do advanced analytics. We have a lot of different topics we cover on the YouTube channel. And with this, I thank you. I thank the speaker and Dave as well, assisting us answering the questions. And thank you to all of you in the audience. We hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.